The day the Karen from the HOA called the police on my cabin, the valley wore its mourning like a secret fog curled low over the pines. The lake mirrored a sky that felt too honest for neighborhood drama about to unfold. I was standing on the porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching sunlight slice through scaffolding and half-built porches like a film reel. Then the shouting started down by the gravel road, sharp, entitled, the kind of voice that thinks rules were written to be recited, not questioned. She stormed up my drive in a sundress and a fury that belonged to someone who'd never dug her hands into the soil. "This is private property," she said, arms wide as if declaring herself the judge of the valley. "You can't be here." Her phone was already out, a live performance in 3 acts. The neighbors watched from their trimmed hedges, political flags fluttering like stage banners. I stepped forward, calm in a way that surprised me, and I said 2 words, "I own it." Silence snapped like a wire. She laughed, a bark of disbelief, and dialed 911 before I could finish my second cup. Cameras on porches tilted like curious eyes. The sheriff's cruiser that pulled up had the slow, careful approach of someone who'd been called about neighborhood squabbles more times than they could count. By then, the Karen had spun a story: trespasser, suspicious person, potential threat. The dispatcher's voice over her phone sounded official, empty of the small details that matter in a valley where histories are buried deeper than the asphalt. And at the end, "Stay with me, I'm going to tell you something important that you need to hear." They arrived polite, patient, a man and a woman who smelled of coffee and miles of paperwork. I walked them through the cabin, wood stacked like the ribs of a ship, maps laid out on the table, deed copies folded into a folder that had survived rainstorms and lawyers. The Karen, meanwhile, was narrating a different movie to anyone who would listen. "He's squatting," she said, voice gaining sympathy like a choir catching a tune. Eyes shifted in the cul-de-sac. People like certainty. Certainty wears uniforms. I opened the drawer and pulled out what stopped the whole neighborhood cold. An old survey stamped by the county, signatures curled like proof, a chain of titles stretching back through names that sounded like the valley itself. I explained slowly, because the stakes were human and the truth was not a soundbite. This cabin sat on land I had purchased 5 years earlier when my grandfather's will finally cleared. The lake cabin had been a rumor in our family for decades, a patch of shoreline people assumed belonged to the HOA because they'd paved the road and put up private signs. History, I learned, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers under bylaws and building plans. The officers read the survey, and their faces changed in ways that a script would try to fake. "You have the deed?" one asked, not unkind. I handed it over. She, the Karen, watched with a face that moved from indignation to calculation. In those minutes, I felt the valley tilt. The people who had supported her authority on mailboxes and mulch started to look at the ground they stood on like it might be a fragile thing. But this wasn't just about paper. It was about legacy and the quiet ways communities can forget the people who own the land beneath the headlines. It was about the arrogance of someone who assumes a neighborhood can be governed by a rule book and a well-placed megaphone. It was about how the lake, which reflected every injustice and kindness in equal measure, had been treated like a trophy instead of the source of our water and history. Things escalated when she accused me of intimidating behavior, the kind of claim that blooms fast and smells false. My neighbors, who'd always waved but never asked the hard questions, started to rearrange themselves like furniture in a house that suddenly needed to fit new people. My voice, however, stayed steady. I invited the officers to call the county records. I invited them to trace back the ledger lines. They did. The minutes crawled, but the truth moved faster than gossip. By the time the sun slid under the ridge, the Karen's calls for enforcement. Had the uneasy sound of someone realizing they'd bet on the wrong horse. What she didn't know, what not everyone in that cul-de-sac understood, was that owning land isn't just legal jargon. It's memory, the names in the margins, the storms survived by the porch posts, the way a valley remembers the people who walk it. When the officers left, polite and professional, there were apologies in the air the size of small bluebirds, quiet, awkward, the sort that come when someone realizes they misread a map. But the real reckoning had already begun. The Karen's power was the illusion of rightness. My power was a piece of paper and a past that would not be erased. The next morning, the valley woke up different. Fog clung lower, birds moved quieter. And the neighbors, the same ones who watched yesterday's drama like a live HOA courtroom, now stepped outside with a kind of cautious humility. The Karen's voice, once the siren of every dispute within 3 miles, was nowhere to be heard, but her absence didn't bring peace. Not yet, because something had shifted inside the community, and something had shifted inside me. I walked the tree line just after sunrise. Dew washed the earth in silver, and the lake shimmered like a promise waiting to be honored. My grandfather had always said the valley wasn't land, it was a story. And every story has villains, heroes, turning points, and buried truths. Yesterday had revealed all of them at once. Halfway through my walk, I found the Karen standing stiffly at the edge of my property, or rather, her imagined property. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't gesturing, she wasn't even holding her phone, she was just there. "I suppose you're waiting for me to apologize," she said, arms crossed but eyes unsettled. "No," I replied, "I'm waiting for you to understand." She blinked like I'd spoken in a language she didn't know. Most HOA tyrants never needed to understand. They just enforced, they dictated, they lived in a world measured by fines and violations, not meaning. "I've run this neighborhood for 8 years," she said. "People rely on me. They expect order." Order, I repeated, looking toward the lake. "Or control." She flinched, the kind of flinch you see when someone has been caught holding a truth they never admitted aloud. The morning breeze pushed the pine branches overhead, scattering needles like falling confetti. "You built rules on land that was never yours," I continued. "You patrolled shoreline that doesn't belong to you. And yesterday you called the police on someone stepping into their own family's history." Her jaw tightened. "I was just trying to protect our community, then learn what it actually stands on." I reached into my backpack and pulled out an old map, the original 1952 survey of the valley, the one my grandfather kept hidden under floorboards. I unfolded it carefully. The paper, yellowed and fragile, still carried the signatures of the first settlers, the crest of the county, and the boundary lines marked with deliberate strokes. Her eyes widened. "This," she whispered, "this is everything." "It is," I said. "And the valley didn't start when the HOA got here. It started long before the bylaws, long before the cul-de-sacs, long before you decided who belongs and who doesn't." The wind quieted. A squirrel paused mid-branch as if listening. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked finally. "Because someday someone will challenge your authority. And when they do, maybe instead of calling the cops, you'll remember to look deeper." For the first time since I'd met her, she softened. Not much, not enough to change who she was overnight, but enough to make the valley breathe again. She left without another word. By noon, the neighborhood gathered near the community mailbox, a rare event without Karen's orders. Word had spread, and people wanted to hear the truth directly from me. Some carried coffee, some carried guilt. Some carried curiosity sharper than the mountain air. I told them everything, the inheritance, the deed, the real boundaries of the valley. The cabin that stood before their HOA existed, The stories etched into the land long before the first paved road, and for the first time since this community stood here, they listened. When I finished, there was a silence you could fold into your pocket. Then the oldest neighbor, a man who rarely talked but always observed, stepped forward. "You're not just the owner of that cabin," he said. "You're the keeper of the valley." I didn't respond right away, because keepers aren't chosen, they're revealed. And in that moment, the valley revealed me. That night, I stood on the cabin porch, the lake calm as a sleeping giant. The stars shimmered above, brighter than I remembered. The valley was quiet, honest, settled. The same officers who had visited the day before drove by, slowed their cruiser, and offered a nod, a small acknowledgment of truth restored. This place, once threatened by confusion and control, now breathed freely again. And as I watched the moon ripple across the water, I realized something. Revenge isn't always about striking back. Sometimes revenge is simply reclaiming what was always yours and letting the truth outshine every lie built against it.